It was a crisp morning at JFK Airport. Passengers bustled through the terminal, dragging carry-ons and balancing coffee cups as the airport's PA system announced final boarding calls. In the middle of the chaos, Janet, a seasoned flight attendant with over a decade of experience, stood at Gate 14. Her crisp uniform and tightly pinned blonde bun reflected her reputation for being efficient and no-nonsense. But Janet also had a secret reputation, one whispered about in hushed tones by her colleagues. She had a particular disdain for passengers she deemed out of place. That morning, Janet was assigned to Flight 725, a first-class route from New York to Los Angeles. As the gate agents began scanning tickets for priority boarding, Janet stationed herself by the jet bridge, offering half-hearted smiles to the well-dressed passengers stepping into first class. Toward the end of boarding, a small figure appeared. An elderly black woman, her silver hair peeking out from a neat scarf, shuffled onto the plane with a dignified gait. She wore a simple cardigan and carried a modest handbag. Her face was soft, yet commanding, like someone who had seen the world but carried her wisdom with quiet grace. Janet's eyes narrowed the moment she spotted her. What's she doing in first class? Janet thought, hiding her disapproval behind a tight-lipped smile. When the elderly woman approached Janet and handed over her boarding pass, Janet scanned it, feigning confusion. "Ma'am," Janet said, in a tone dripping with condescension, "this is first class." The woman smiled kindly, her voice calm but firm. "Yes, dear, I know. That's my seat. 2A. Janet hesitated, scanning the ticket again. It was valid, but something in her couldn't accept it. "Are you sure this is your seat? Sometimes people get these mixed up," she pressed, her smile now a thinly veiled sneer. The woman chuckled softly, her eyes sparkling with patience. "I'm sure, young lady. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to settle in." Frustrated but unable to argue further, Janet begrudgingly stepped aside. As the woman made her way to her seat, Janet whispered to a colleague, "Probably won the lottery or something." They both laughed quietly. Once airborne, Janet's behavior escalated. She ignored the elderly woman during drink service, purposefully serving other passengers first. When the woman politely requested a blanket, Janet brought it begrudgingly, practically tossing it onto her lap. The woman said nothing, maintaining her composure. The final straw came during meal service. Janet, with a forced smile, leaned over and said, "Ma'am, we have a limited selection today. I'm afraid we're out of the filet mignon." The woman raised an eyebrow, her voice calm but unwavering. "I see. What do you have left?" Janet smirked. "The chicken salad." She emphasized the word salad as though it were a punishment. Another passenger overheard and intervened. "Excuse me, but I ordered after her, and I just got the filet. Why can't she have it?" Janet flushed. I must have made a mistake. I'll check again," she stammered, storming off. As the flight neared its descent, Janet noticed a buzz among the first-class passengers. Her colleagues were whispering nervously, glancing toward the elderly woman. Janet approached one of them. "What's going on?" she asked. Her colleague looked shocked. "You don't know? That's Mrs. Evelyn Wright. Her father is Charles Wright. He owns this airline." Janet's heart dropped. Charles Wright was a name she knew well. The airline's founder was a legend in the industry, a self-made billionaire. No panic set in. Janet quickly concocted a plan to apologize and smooth things over. She approached Mrs. Wright, her tone suddenly sweet and deferential. "Mrs. Wright," she began, her voice trembling. I just wanted to apologize if I seemed inattentive earlier. It's been a hectic flight and—" Mrs. Wright held up a hand, silencing her. Her eyes, calm all flight, now carried a steely resolve. "Young lady," she said softly but firmly, "let me give you some advice. Never judge someone by the color of their skin, the clothes they wear, or the way they carry themselves. You never know who you're speaking to or who might be watching." Janet stammered, I didn't mean to—" Mrs. Wright interrupted again, this time with a kind but cutting smile. "I've already spoken with the captain. He's arranging a meeting with corporate when we land. Perhaps they'll help you find a position more suited to your talents." Janet felt the blood drain from her face. "Mrs. Wright, please—" But the conversation was over. Mrs. Wright turned back to her book, her quiet dignity unshaken. When the flight landed, Janet's worst fears came true. She was called into a meeting with corporate leadership, where Mrs. Wright's complaint was waiting on the desk. Janet was terminated that same day. The experience left Janet shaken, but it also served as a wake-up call. Months later, she found herself working at a diner in her hometown, far from the glamour of first-class flights. One day, while wiping down a table, she caught her reflection in the window and remembered Mrs. Wright's words. From that moment on, Janet vowed to treat everyone she met with kindness and respect, regardless of who they were or who they might be. Meanwhile, Mrs. Wright continued her travels, carrying her father's legacy with grace and a quiet determination to make the world a little better, one flight at a time. This story is a reminder of the importance of humility and the dangers of prejudice. It shows how a single moment of cruelty can ripple into consequences far beyond what we expect, and how even the worst mistakes can become lessons for change.